At Hampton Court Palace, visitors still shudder at the legend of the desperate screams echoing from the haunted gallery on quiet nights. It is the ghost of Katherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, running toward the chapel and pounding on the doors to beg for a forgiveness that never came. History has framed her within the rhyme "divorced, beheaded, died" as the second to be executed, branding her with harsh labels like wanton or traitor. In reality, beneath the splendid royal robes was merely a wildflower crushed early on by the schemes of ambitious men. She was not a fallen queen driven by lust, but an abused child pushed into a mismatched marriage and ruthlessly sacrificed for power. Let us sweep away the dust of prejudice to revisit the life of Katherine Howard, not through the lens of the victors, but through the eyes of a lonely young girl amidst the brutal Tudor dynasty. England, named in the late 1530s, was a terrifying place gripped by psychic trauma, revolving around a king who was no longer a golden god, but a dying son. By age 49, Henry VIII had transformed from an athletic scholar into a paranoid, vicious tyrant. Grossly obese and needing a crane to mount his horse, his true horror was a festering, ulcerated leg wound from an old jousting accident. The constant blinding pain and putrid smell tormented him, fueling his rage and making him see betrayal in every shadow. Simultaneously, the country was tearing itself apart over the Reformation. Thomas Cromwell, the king's ruthless minister, was dissolving ancient monasteries, stripping their gold, and destroying the bones of saints, which horrified the Catholic world, but delighted Protestant reformers. The royal court became a battlefield where two factions circled the wounded king like wolves: the reformers, who wanted a modern state and a break from Rome, and the conservatives, who longed for the old ways and hated the upstart Cromwell. Leading the conservative faction was the perilous Howard family, headed by the Duke of Norfolk. A man of war devoid of sentimentality, the Duke viewed his relatives not as loved ones, but as assets to be played or discarded in the game of power. He had even condemned his own niece, Anne Boleyn, without blinking. To oust Cromwell and regain control, the Howards needed a specific bait that the sick, sentimental king could not resist: youth and vitality. They found their solution in a neglected niece named Katherine, seeing her not as a person, but as a pretty blank slate. Katherine Howard, however, was born on the wrong side of aristocratic wealth due to the brutal system of primogeniture. While the Duke of Norfolk inherited the titles and fortune, Katherine's father, Lord Edmund Howard, was a third son who received nothing but a famous name. Although Edmund was a brave soldier who had commanded troops at the Battle of Flodden, bravery could not pay the bills, and he was structurally incapable of managing finances. Edmund became a tragic, pathetic figure who spent his life drowning in debt and hiding from creditors to avoid prison. He was reduced to writing letters begging Cardinal Wolsey for scraps, admitting he had nothing to live by. It was from this background of desperate insecurity and poverty that Katherine was plucked by her ruthless uncle to play the most dangerous role in England. Katherine was born sometime between 1521 and 1524. The records are so sparse because nobody thought her birth was important enough to record. She was likely born at Lambeth, in a house that felt more like a siege fortification against bailiffs than a noble home. Her mother was Joyce Culpeper. Joyce was a woman of immense fertility and exhaustion. By the time she married Edmund Howard, she was already a widow with 5 children from a previous marriage. She then proceeded to have 6 more children with Edmund. Katherine was one of the youngest of this massive, chaotic brood of 11 children. The house would have been crowded, noisy, and stressful, but for a few short years, Katherine had a mother. Joyce Culpeper was the anchor, She was the one who likely kept the creditors at bay with charm, who managed the household accounts, who provided the only warmth Catherine would ever know. But in the Tudor world, death was always waiting. Around 1528, when Catherine was barely a toddler, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, Joyce Culpeper died. The anchor was gone. Lord Edmund Howard, already useless at parenting and finance, completely collapsed. He was a man overwhelmed. He had a house full of children he couldn't feed, a reputation in tatters, and no wife to manage his domestic affairs. He did what aristocratic men of his time often did with surplus children. He farmed them out. He looked at his small daughter, Catherine, and saw not a child who needed comfort, but a mouth he couldn't feed. He arranged for her to be sent away. She was packed off to live with his stepmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Agnes Tilney. This moment is the pivot point of Catherine's life. If her mother had lived, Catherine might have been married off to a minor country squire. She would have lived a quiet life in the countryside, had 10 children, and died in her bed of old age. She would have been happy. She would have been anonymous. Instead, she was sent to the Dowager Duchess. It sounded like a privilege. The Duchess was one of the richest women in England. She maintained massive estates at Chesworth House in Horsham and Norfolk House in Lambeth. Living there should have been an education in high society. But Lord Edmund wasn't sending his daughter to a finishing school. He was sending her to a place that modern historians have likened to a boarding school with no teachers. He was sending a vulnerable, uneducated, motherless child into a den of wolves. As the carriage wheels churned the mud of the English countryside, leaving behind the suffocating dead of her father's house, Catherine likely felt a flicker of hope. She was trading poverty for the immense wealth of the Howard dynasty, but she was not entering a sanctuary. She was entering a vacuum. The Dowager Duchess's household was a place where the grandeur of the architecture masked a total absence of moral guardianship. Catherine was stepping out of the frying pan of neglect and into the fire of exploitation, where the lessons she would learn would not be of books or scripture, but of secrets, silence, and the dangerous power of her own allure. When Catherine arrived at her step-grandmother's estate, she stepped into a world that was grand on the surface but rotten underneath. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Agnes Tilney, was a relic of a bygone era. She was the widow of the second Duke, a woman of immense social standing who had carried the train of queens. She ran a household that was less a family home and more a medieval corporation. At Chesworth House in Horsham, and later at the family's London residence in Lambeth, the household contained over 100 people. There were gentlemen ushers, ladies-in-waiting, chambermaids, cooks, stable boys, and secretaries. It was a bustling, chaotic microcosm of society. The Duchess herself was elderly and often absent, attending court or managing her vast business interests. She viewed her charge, young Catherine, not as a granddaughter to be nurtured, but as a distant obligation. She provided Catherine with food, shelter, and clothes, but she provided absolutely no supervision. Catherine was placed in the maiden's chamber. To modern ears, this sounds like a protected, chaste environment. In reality, it was a large communal dormitory where the Duchess's female wards and gentlewomen slept. But it wasn't just young noblewomen. Servants slept there too. It was a crowded, giggling, chaotic space where social barriers dissolved after dark. And crucially, the keys to this dormitory were easily stolen. In this environment, Catherine's education was woefully neglected. Think of the other wives of Henry VIII. Catherine of Aragon was trained to rule a kingdom. Anne Boleyn was educated in the sophisticated courts of France and Burgundy. She read French poetry and debated religious reform. Jane Seymour was literate and managed a large country estate. Catherine Parr was a published author. Katherine Howard was taught none of this. No one sat her down with Latin grammars. No one taught her history or theology. She was taught to read and write in English, but her handwriting, which we can see in her few surviving letters, was large, childish, and phonetic. She struggled to express herself on paper. Instead, her education focused on the only thing her family thought she was good for, being decorative. She learned to dance. She learned to dress. She learned to play the lute in the virginals. She learned how to be charming. She was being trained to catch a husband, not to survive a court. She was a bright, bubbly girl with a natural charisma, but her mind was left completely unsharpened, and a sharp mind was the only defense against what was coming next. Around 1536, when Katherine was roughly 12 or 13 years old, a man named Henry Mannix entered her orbit. Mannix was a musician employed by the Duchess to teach the young ladies the virginals, a keyboard instrument, and the lute. He was in his late 30s. Katherine was a child just entering puberty. In a well-regulated household, a music lesson would take place with a chaperone, perhaps the Duchess herself, or a senior lady-in-waiting sitting in the corner doing needlepoint. But at Chesworth, there were no chaperones. Mannix identified Katherine as especially impressionable due to her modest background, limited family guidance, and need for encouragement. He cultivated her trust with positive feedback on her appearance and skills, offering comfort to a girl who had known hardship and loss. Their lessons moved to private settings like the chapel or orchard, where Mannix overstepped appropriate boundaries in his interactions. Historical accounts emphasize the unequal dynamics. As a young person under an older authority's influence, Katherine faced encroachments on her personal boundaries. Mannix displayed overly intense emotions and required discretion. This persisted briefly, but his servant status barred any formal connection in Tudor society's strict class system. Marriage to a Howard relative was impossible. Katherine, even young, seemed to understand this as a temporary hidden matter. The experience may have prematurely shaped her views on self-worth and relationships. As she withdrew, a new figure emerged around 1538 with household changes, Francis Derham. Unlike Mannix, Derham was a gentleman pensioner, a secretary and distant kin, youthful, charismatic, and adventurous from time in Ireland, possibly in seafaring pursuits. He represented a bold, appealing presence and focused on Katherine. By then, supervision in the maiden's chamber was minimal. The elderly Duchess retired early elsewhere, leaving the space unsupervised at night. Derham and others occasionally accessed the area informally, bringing treats for casual gatherings, filled with light-hearted youthful interactions that tested household norms. Derham and Katherine formed a deep bond akin to intense young affection. In 16th century terms, this went beyond casual ties. They used spousal terms like husband and wife. This created a key legal point under canon law, where marriage required only mutual present tense vows, verba de presenti, and fulfillment of the union, forming a binding pre-contract, needing ecclesiastical dissolution. They exchanged such commitments before peers with symbolic gifts, a silk flower from him, an embroidered item from her, and he entrusted her with his assets, signaling deep trust. Their close association was evident to dormitory companions like Mary Lascelles and Alice Restwold, who noted their exclusive pairing. Katherine saw herself as committed, envisioning a simple future with a minor gentleman at about age 15. Jealous Mannix intervened once, discovering them together, and later made unfounded claims about prior closeness, which Katherine angrily denied. The secrecy ended in 1539 when the Duchess, suspecting irregularities, inspected the chamber, found signs of laxity, reprimanded the group, including Katherine, and addressed it as minor indiscipline, not probing further. Derham, fearing family repercussions, left for Ireland, entrusting Katherine with his funds and promising return. She agreed emotionally. With time, the attachment faded amid absence. Legally, she might have been bound. Socially, revelations could limit prospects. But details stayed contained. The Duchess downplayed them, and others remained silent. Katherine matured into a charming young woman, petite, with auburn hair and lively spirit. She presented as composed and innocent. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, visited unaware of past events, seeing only a promising Howard kin with grace and appeal. He looked at Katherine, and he didn't see a niece. He saw a weapon. King Henry was unhappy with Anne of Cleves. The Catholic faction needed a new candidate. The Duke decided that this little girl, this neglected orphan from the Maiden's Chamber, was going to be the next Queen of England. Katherine was summoned to court. She was given expensive clothes. She was told to smile, to dance, and to catch the king's eye. With her past buried in the whispers of the dormitory and her husband, Derham, in exile across the Irish Sea, Katherine stepped into the blinding light of the royal court. She was leaving behind the sordid, secret world of stolen kisses and midnight feasts for a stage where every glance was analyzed and every smile was political currency. The girl who had been groomed in the shadows was about to be thrust into the highest office in the land, armed with nothing but her beauty and a dangerous naivety. She believed she had left her ghost behind in Lambeth, but as she curtsied before the aging, desperate king, she was unknowingly beginning a dance that would resurrect them all. In late 1539, Katherine Howard arrived at the court of King Henry VIII. To a teenage girl who had spent her life in the drafty, neglected corridors of the Dowager Duchess's house, the royal court must have felt like stepping onto the surface of the sun. It was a sensory overload of velvet, gold leaf, roasting meat, and perfume masking the stench of unwashed bodies. It was the most dangerous place in Europe. Katherine was appointed as a maid of honor to the new queen, Anne of Cleves. The position was the dream of every noble girl in England. It meant proximity to power. It meant access to the best marriages. But Katherine walked into a court that was holding its breath. The king's marriage to Anne of Cleves was a disaster from the start. Henry, expecting a German beauty based on a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein, had been horrified by the reality. He found Anne dull, heavy-featured, and smelling of strange meats. He was physically repulsed by her. He was unable to consummate the marriage. The king was humiliated, and a humiliated king is a deadly animal. He was looking for an escape, and more importantly, he was looking for a distraction. The Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, saw the king's misery and knew exactly what to do. He pushed his niece forward. He made sure Katherine was dancing where the king could see her. He ensured she was dressed in the French fashion, tight bodices, flared sleeves, which Henry preferred over the heavy, cumbersome German styles worn by the queen. And it worked. Henry VIII was 49 years old. He was obese, in constant pain, and terrified of his own mortality. When he looked at Katherine Howard, he didn't see a girl with a scandalous past. He didn't see the wife of Francis Derham. He saw a mirror that reflected his own lost youth. She was petite, while he was enormous. She was bursting with giggles and energy, while he was moody and grim. She was submissive, while his previous wives had been political, Aragon, argumentative, Boleyn, or dull, Cleves. Henry called her his rose without a thorn. It was a projection of his own desperate need for purity. He convinced himself that he had found the one thing that had eluded him for 30 years, a perfect, innocent woman who would love him for himself, not his crown. The courtship was swift, public, and overwhelmingly materialistic. Henry wooed Catherine not with poetry, but with property. In the spring of 1540, while he was still legally married to Anne of Cleves, the gifts began to flow. He gave Catherine ropes of pearls. He gave her diamonds. He granted her the lands of criminals he had executed. He gave her furs to keep out the chill. For Catherine, this was intoxicating. Remember, this was a girl who had grown up wearing patched dresses, whose father had begged for loans. Suddenly, the most powerful man on earth was treating her like a goddess. She was a teenager suddenly handed the keys to a kingdom with absolutely no concept of the price she would eventually have to pay. But there was a dark political game being played beneath the romance. The Duke of Norfolk and his ally Bishop Stephen Gardiner were using Catherine to destroy Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was the architect of the Cleves marriage. If Henry rejected Anne of Cleves, he would reject Cromwell. And if he embraced Katherine Howard, he would embrace the Catholic faction. Catherine was coached. She was told what to say, when to smile, and when to be demure. She was a puppet, dancing on strings held by ruthless men. She likely didn't understand the theology or the politics. She just knew that if she pleased the king, her family was happy, and she was rich. By July 1540, the dominoes fell. The marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled on the grounds of non-consummation and a convenient prearranged pre-contract Anne had with the Duke of Lorraine. Anne, wise enough to value her neck over her crown, accepted the title of king's sister and retired with a massive settlement. The path was clear. On July 28, 1540, Henry VIII married Katherine Howard at Oatlands Palace in Surrey. It was a private, modest ceremony compared to the grand state occasions of the past. Henry was eager. He didn't want pageantry. He wanted possession. But the date is significant. July 28th was not just a wedding day. At the exact same time that Henry was slipping the ring onto Catherine's finger, on Tower Hill in London, the axe was falling on the neck of Thomas Cromwell. The king's most loyal servant, the man who had made Henry the head of the church, was butchered in a messy execution because he had failed to get the king a wife he liked. It was a grim omen. Catherine's marriage bed was built on a scaffold. Catherine chose her motto, non autre volonté que la sienne, no other will but his. It was a motto of total submission. She was determined to be the perfect wife, and for the first few months she succeeded. The king was ecstatic. He was rejuvenated. He woke up early, 5 a.m. or 6 a.m., to go hunting. He showered her with affection. He publicly thanked God for the good life he led with her. But once the honeymoon phase faded, the reality of the marriage set in, and it was a horror story. We must be blunt about the physical reality of this marriage. Catherine was roughly 19. Henry was 50, but a wrecked 50. His leg ulcer was a constant presence. It required daily lancing and draining. The smell of rotting flesh would have permeated the bedchamber, barely masked by herbs and musk. Henry was often immobile, needing to be moved via a system of pulleys or carried in a chair. He was also moody. The pain made him lash out. He could be doting 1 minute and screaming in rage the next. And then there was the issue of the bedroom. Henry was desperate for another son, a Duke of York, to secure the succession alongside Prince Edward, Jane Seymour's son. But by 1540, Henry struggled with impotence. Imagine the pressure on Catherine. Every night she had to enter the bed of a rotting, moody, obese tyrant and try to arouse him. If she failed, it wasn't just a marital disappointment. It was a matter of state security. If she didn't get pregnant, her position was weak. Catherine was not equipped for this. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a politician. She was a girl who liked to dance, who liked pretty clothes, and who liked to laugh. She was bored. The court was filled with old men discussing theology and war. Katherine wanted to have fun. She began to feel the cage closing in around her. It is a rule of blackmail. You can run, but you cannot hide. When Katherine became queen, she became a target. The people from her past, the servants, the hangers-on from the maiden's chamber, crawled out of the woodwork. They knew her secret. They knew about Henry Mannix. They knew about Francis Derham. They began to show up at court asking for jobs. This is where Katherine made her fatal error. A smarter woman, a more ruthless woman might have had them dismissed or even arrested. But Katherine was young, she was kind-hearted, and she was terrified. She thought she could buy their silence with kindness. She gave a job to Henry Mannix. She appointed him as a musician in her household. The man who had groomed her and touched her secrets was now playing music while she dined with the king. Then Francis Derham returned. He came back from Ireland hearing that his wife was now the Queen of England. He arrived at Hampton Court and demanded a position. Katherine panicked. If Derham spoke, she was ruined. If he told the king about the pre-contract, the marriage would be annulled and she would be cast out in disgrace. So she hired him. She made Francis Derham her private secretary. It was an act of supreme stupidity, but also of desperation. She brought the wolf right into the sheepfold. Derham was arrogant. He ate at the queen's table. He bragged to the other servants. He treated Katherine with a familiarity that shocked onlookers. He once said, "I could tell the king things that would spoil his sport." Katherine was now surrounded by her past abusers. She was trapped in a marriage to a sick old man. She was lonely. She was scared. And in the spring of 1541, with her judgment clouded by stress and boredom, her eye began to wander. She looked across the crowded room of the king's privy chamber and saw a young man. He was tall. He was handsome. He was a favorite of the king. He was everything Henry used to be, and everything Henry was not. His name was Thomas Culpeper, and standing in the shadows watching Katherine's gaze linger on him was Lady Rochford, the woman who would help burn the whole house down. Whatever excitement Katherine felt at her elevation was quickly corroded by the grotesque reality of her marriage. She had traded her freedom for jewels, only to find herself the nursemaid to a decaying tyrant. The isolation of her position was absolute. She was a queen without allies, a wife without a husband in the true sense, and a teenager suffocating under the weight of expectation. It was in this vacuum of boredom and revulsion that her judgment began to fracture. Desperate for a reflection of her own youth and vitality, she turned her gaze away from the king's ulcerated leg and toward the one man in court who represented everything she was missing, a decision that would transform her from a bored wife into a traitor. To understand why Katherine Howard risked her life, we must look at the man she risked it for. Thomas Culpeper was everything Henry VIII was not. He was young, likely in his mid to late 20s. He was athletic, blonde, handsome, and arrogant. But Culpeper was not just a pretty face at court. He was a man of significant power. He was a gentleman of the privy chamber. This meant he was one of the king's closest personal attendants. He slept in the king's bedchamber. He dressed the king. He nursed the king's ulcerated leg. He was the son Henry never had. However, historical records suggest Thomas Culpeper was also a violent, unpleasant man. Years earlier, he had been accused of raping a park keeper's wife while his men held the woman down, and then killing a villager who tried to intervene. Remarkably, Henry VIII had pardoned him. The king loved Culpeper. He indulged him. Katherine, trapped in a marriage to a sick, impotent old man, looked at Culpeper and saw escape. She saw romance. She saw a peer. It was a fatal attraction. A girl who had been abused by men of lower rank falling for a man who was untouchable, reckless, and cruel. The affair or the flirtation would never have happened without Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Lady Rochford is the dark spirit of the Tudor court. She was the widow of George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brother. In 1536, it was her testimony, or at least information attributed to her, that had helped send her husband and sister-in-law to the block for incest. She had survived the fall of the Boleyns and clawed her way back to influence as Catherine's lady of the bedchamber. For centuries, historians have debated the chilling question of why she helped Catherine destroy herself. Some suggest she was a voyeur, deriving a vicarious thrill from orchestrating the young queen's illicit romance, while others argue that the trauma of 1536 may have left her mentally unstable and broken. However, it is also possible that she was simply following the tragic logic of a lady-in-waiting whose sole purpose is to please. If the queen desired Culpeper, Jane saw it as her job to provide him. Whatever the motive, Lady Rochford became the architect of the treason. She carried the messages. She arranged the times. She stood guard at the door. In the summer of 1541, the massive machinery of the royal court began to move. Henry VIII organized a great progress to the north of England. The north had been rebellious, the pilgrimage of grace, and Henry wanted to show his face to cow the population into submission. It was a logistical nightmare. Thousands of people, carts, horses, and tents moving slowly through the English countryside. But for Catherine, it was a summer of freedom. Away from the stifling atmosphere of London, the rules relaxed. The king was often busy with councils and hunting. The lodgings in the various castles and manor houses were unfamiliar with connecting doors and back staircases that weren't as heavily guarded as the royal palaces in London. This is where the tragedy unfolded. At Lincoln, at Pontefract, at York, in the shadows of these great castles, Catherine and Culpeper met. The mechanics of the affair were terrifyingly risky. Late at night, after the king had gone to bed, usually early due to his health, Lady Rochford would smuggle Culpeper into the queen's apartments. Sometimes they met in Lady Rochford's room. Sometimes Culpeper would come up the back stairs. What did they do? When the scandal broke, both Catherine and Culpeper would desperately try to minimize their physical contact. Catherine claimed they sat in a corner and talked. She admitted to allowing him to touch her hand. She admitted to calling him her little sweet fool. Culpeper, under interrogation, admitted that he intended to sleep with her, but that he never actually did. He claimed the queen was the aggressor, that she was dying of love for him. Did they consummate the affair? We will never know for sure, but in the eyes of the law, it didn't matter. To imagine the death of the king is treason. To sleep with the queen is treason. To plan to sleep with the queen is treason. The emotional betrayal was absolute. While Henry was bragging to foreign ambassadors about his perfect, virtuous wife, that wife was meeting his favorite servant in the dark, giving him gifts, a gold chain, a cap of velvet. The most damning piece of evidence, the smoking gun that history has preserved, is a letter Catherine wrote to Culpeper. It was found among his belongings after his arrest. He should have burned it. The fact that he kept it suggests he was either sentimental or, more likely, keeping it as insurance, blackmail material. The letter is written in Catherine's messy phonetic scrawl. It is a heartbreaking window into her mind. It is not the letter of a political plotter. It is the letter of a love-struck teenager. She writes, "Master Culpeper, I heartily recommend me unto you, praying you to send me word how that you do." She worries about him being sick. She talks about the difficulty of arranging meetings. It makes my heart die to think I cannot be always in your company. And she ends with a line that seals her fate. Yours as long as life endures, Katherine. As long as life endures. She was pledging herself to him. In the context of her previous pre-contract with Derham, this language of commitment was incredibly dangerous. She was playing house again, just like she did in the dormitory. But this time, the dormitory was the king's palace, and the penalty for getting caught wasn't a scolding from the Duchess. It was death. By late October 1541, the progress was over. The court returned to the south, settling at Hampton Court and Windsor. Katherine must have felt a sense of relief. She had gotten away with it. The summer was over. The fling had not been discovered. Frances Derham was working quietly as her secretary, though behaving arrogantly. Henry Mannix was playing his music. Culpeper was back in the king's chamber. The king was happier than he had been in years. He was so convinced of Katherine's virtue that on All Saints' Day, November 1st, he ordered a special mass. He knelt in the chapel royal and directed his confessor to give thanks to God meant for the good life he led and hoped to lead with his beloved wife. He was a man totally deluded. But while the king was praying, the axe was already being sharpened. The blow did not come from the king's enemies. It came from the Protestants, the reformers who had been waiting for the Howards to slip up. While the court was in the north, a man named John Lascelles, a Protestant reformer, had gone to see Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Lascelles had a sister, Mary, who had been a servant in the old Duchess's household. Mary had told her brother the stories about the Maiden's Chamber. She told him about Mannix. She told him about Derham. She told him that the new queen was not a virgin. Cranmer listened. He knew this was the weapon he needed. If Katherine was not a virgin when she married the king, the marriage could be invalid. The Catholic Howard faction would be humiliated. But Cranmer was terrified. He knew the king's temper. If he told the king and it turned out to be a lie, Cranmer would be executed. If he didn't tell the king and it came out later, Cranmer would be executed for concealing treason. He had to act. On November 2nd, 1541, the day after the king's prayer of thanks, Henry attended Mass again. As he walked to his pew, Cranmer stepped forward. He did not speak. He simply handed the king a sealed note. Henry, annoyed by the interruption, took the paper. He opened it. He read the accusations that his rose without a thorn was a woman of loose morals who had lived in sin with 2 men before her marriage. The king stopped. The court watched. Henry did not explode. He did not scream. He simply couldn't process it. He called it a wretched. He loved Katherine. He trusted her. He ordered a secret investigation, telling his counselors to look into it quietly to clear the queen's name so he could punish the liars. He had no idea that pulling that single thread would unravel the entire tapestry of his life. The summer of the Great Progress had been a season of illusion, a fever dream where Katherine believed the rules of the court did not apply to her. She had played the dangerous game of romance and believed she had won. But as the leaves turned and the court returned to the rigid confines of London, the invisible machinery of her destruction was already grinding into motion. While Katherine and Henry basked in the glow of their supposed marital bliss, a single conversation in a quiet room was about to light a fuse that would blow the House of Howard apart. The secrets of the Maiden's Chamber were no longer secrets. They were now weapons in the hands of men who showed no mercy. The days following November 2nd, 1541, were played out in a suffocating silence at Hampton Court. The king had ordered a secret investigation, still believing the accusations were a malicious plot by the Protestants to ruin his happiness. He sent his most trusted counselors, Sir Thomas Wriothesley and the Earl of Southampton, to interview the informant John Lascelles. They grilled Lascelles. They warned him that if he was lying, he would die a painful death. Lascelles stood firm. He gave them the names of others who knew. the women who had slept in the maiden's chamber. The investigators moved quietly. They tracked down the old servants. They found Henry Mannix. Mannix, the musician who had groomed the young Katherine, was a coward. The moment the king's men cornered him, he folded. He admitted everything about his own behavior, but he was desperate to shift the blame. He told the investigators, "I am not the one you want. Frances Dereham is the one who used her like a wife." The investigators then seized Francis Dereham. He was currently serving as the Queen's secretary, walking the halls of the palace with an arrogance that now seemed suicidal. When the evidence was brought back to Henry VIII, the reaction was not the volcanic rage everyone expected. The king did not roar. He did not throw furniture. He wept. The Privy Council watched in horror as their monolithic, terrifying sovereign broke down. Henry VIII sat in his chair and cried openly. It was the weeping of a narcissist who realized that his youth was truly gone, that his rose without a thorn was a fantasy, and that he had been played for a fool by a teenager and her ambitious family. The illusion was shattered, and when a narcissist's illusion breaks, pity is quickly replaced by a desire for annihilation. On November 6th, the king left Hampton Court. He rode away without seeing the Queen. He would never lay eyes on Katherine Howard again. Katherine was confined to her apartments. She was not told exactly what was happening, only that the king was displeased, and she was to remain in her rooms. Panic set in. This is the setting for the most famous ghost story in British history. The legend goes that Katherine, realizing the king was leaving and desperate to plead her case, slipped away from her guards. She ran down the long, timbered corridor, now known as the Haunted Gallery, toward the Chapel Royal where the king was at Mass or just leaving. She reached the door. She pounded on it. She screamed, "Harry! Harry!" The guards caught her. They dragged her back, screaming and kicking, while the king sat on the other side of the door, ignoring her cries. Whether this event happened exactly as described is debated by historians, but the psychological truth is undeniable. Katherine was in a state of hysterical terror. She was weeping so violently that her attendants were afraid she would harm herself. They removed any sharp objects from her room. She alternated between manic laughter and catatonic despair. She knew deep down that the game was up. On the morning of November 7th, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer came to see her. This scene is the pivotal tragedy of Katherine's life. It is the moment where she could have saved herself, and she failed because she didn't understand the rules of the game. Cranmer found her in a state of collapse. He was moved by her distress. He wrote to the king, "I found her in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature." Cranmer had a strategy. He didn't want to execute a young girl. He just wanted to break the power of the Catholic Howard family. He had authorization from the king to offer Katherine a deal. He told her that if she confessed to the pre-contract with Francis Dereham, the king would extend his mercy. Listen to the legal logic carefully, because it is crucial. If Katherine admitted, "Yes, I promised to marry Dereham and I slept with him," then in the eyes of the church she was already married to Dereham when she married Henry. Therefore, her marriage to Henry was invalid. It was null and void. If she was never Henry's wife, she could not be guilty of adultery. If she was not guilty of adultery, she was not guilty of treason. She would be disgraced. She would be divorced. She would likely be sent to a nunnery or exiled to a country house in disgrace. But she would keep her head. Cranmer practically begged her to admit it. "Say you were Dereham's wife," he implied. "Admit the pre-contract." But Katherine didn't understand. She was terrified that admitting she wasn't a virgin would be a death sentence in itself. She was clinging to the only status she had, Queen of England. She thought if she denied the past, she could remain queen. So she made the fatal choice. She denied the pre-contract. She admitted to sleeping with Derham, but she claimed he had raped her. She claimed he forced her. She insisted, "I never promised him marriage." She insisted she was the king's true wife. By clinging to her crown, she signed her death warrant. By insisting she was the lawful queen, she remained subject to the laws of treason. Because Katherine denied the pre-contract, the investigation had to continue. The council had to prove the extent of her crimes. They went back to Francis Derham. The torture began. In the Tower of London, Derham was likely subjected to the breaking his teeth, or the rack. He was a tough man, a pirate and a rogue, but everyone breaks eventually. He admitted the relationship with Katherine, but he was bitter. He knew he was going to die, and he knew that while he was being tortured, the real lover, the man Katherine actually cared about, was still sleeping in soft sheets in the king's privy chamber. Derham spat out the words that changed the investigation from a scandal about the past into a crisis about the present. He told the interrogators, "I am not the man the king should worry about. If you want to know who has succeeded me in the queen's affections, look to Thomas Culpeper." The council was stunned. This wasn't just about a girl who wasn't a virgin. This was about a queen who was cheating on the king right now. The focus shifted instantly to Thomas Culpeper, the king's favorite, the man who had nursed the king's wounds. Culpeper was arrested. His rooms were searched, and there, tucked away, perhaps in a velvet purse, perhaps in a chest, they found the letter. "I never longed so much for a thing as I do to see you. Yours as long as life endures, Katherine." It was over. The council now had evidence of a conspiracy. They had Lady Rochford, who had facilitated the meetings. They had Culpeper, who admitted he intended to sleep with the queen. They had Derham, who claimed a prior claim. The Howards, the powerful family that had put Katherine on the throne, instantly scrambled for the exits. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, wrote a letter to the king denouncing his niece. He called her an abominable deed and expressed his deep sorrow. He threw her to the wolves to save his own skin. He even suggested that she should be burned alive. Katherine was totally alone. On November 14th, Katherine was moved from Hampton Court to Sion Abbey. It was a comfortable imprisonment, but it was a prison nonetheless. She was stripped of her queenship. Her jewels were taken. Her velvet gowns were replaced with simple gray cloth. She remained there through the dark winter of 1541 to 1542. We know little of her state of mind during these months, except that she remained very cheerful and then very weeping by turns. She was likely suffering from a complete nervous breakdown. She may have still believed the king would save her. After all, he had loved her so much. He called her his jewel. Surely he wouldn't kill her. Meanwhile, in London, the legal framework was being established to ensure her permanent confinement in the Tower. The king avoided a trial to evade the public shame of his wife's intimate affairs, being exposed in court, reminiscent of Anne Boleyn's case. So Parliament invented a new weapon. They introduced a bill of attainder. Usually a person accused of treason gets a trial. A bill of attainder is a legislative act that simply declares a person guilty. No trial, no defense, no witnesses. Parliament votes, the king signs, and the person dies. The bill also introduced a terrifying new law, retroactive specifically for Katherine. It became high treason for any woman to marry the king if she was not a virgin, unless she declared it beforehand. They literally changed the law of England to ensure her execution was legal. On February 10, 1542, the barges arrived at Sion Abbey. Katherine was escorted down to the river. The winter wind was biting. The water was gray. They rowed her down the Thames under London Bridge, where the rotting heads of Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper, executed back in December, were stuck on spikes. She would have had to look up and see the faces of the men she had loved. The boat turned toward the Traitor's Gate. The grim portcullis of the Tower of London loomed above her. She was coming home to die. The investigation had stripped Katherine of everything: her crown, her jewels, her friends, and finally, her dignity. She had been moved from palace to abbey, and now, as the winter of 1542 set in, the final journey awaited. The legal loophole she had failed to grasp had closed around her neck, and the king's weeping had hardened into a cold resolve to erase her. There were no more moves left to play, no more favors to call in. The only thing remaining was the final act of the tragedy, played out on the cold stones of the tower, where she would have to summon a courage she had never needed before. On February 10th, 1542, the waiting ended. The Privy Council sent the Duke of Suffolk to Sion Abbey to collect the fallen queen. The journey from Sion to the Tower of London was a piece of theatrical cruelty. They traveled by barge down the River Thames. As the boat slipped through the gray waters, passing under the narrow arches of London Bridge, Katherine would have looked up. Stuck on high spikes above the bridge, rotting in the winter air, were the heads of Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper. The birds would have been picking at them. The skin would have been blackened by the frost. These were the men who had defined her life, one who had abused her youth, and one whom she had loved in her foolish, desperate way. The barge docked at the Traitor's Gate. This was the water entrance to the Tower of London, a grim, low archway with water lapping against the stone steps. 6 years earlier, her cousin Anne Boleyn had stepped onto these same stones. Anne had collapsed weeping. Katherine, by contrast, seems to have been in a state of quiet shock. She was led not to a dungeon, but to the royal apartments, the very rooms that had been refurbished for her coronation just 18 months prior. The velvet hangings were likely still there. The badges of the Rose Without a Thorn might still have been painted on the walls. It was a final mocking reminder of how high she had risen and how far she had fallen. Katherine was not alone in the tower. Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, was there too. But Jane had broken. Under the pressure of interrogation and the guilt of her role in 2 royal executions, her husband George's and now Catherine's, Jane had gone insane. She was suffering from a complete psychotic break, hallucinating, screaming, and babbling. In Tudor law, it was illegal to execute a mad person. It was considered a sin to send a soul to God when it couldn't understand its own death. But Henry VIII was done with mercy. He was done with laws that got in his way. He pushed through a special act of Parliament declaring that the execution could proceed regardless of Lady Rochford's mental state. She would be dragged to the block, sane or mad. We return now to the moment that opened our story. The night of Sunday, February 12th, 1542. Katherine was told she would die the next morning at 7 a.m. Most people would spend these hours writing letters or weeping. Katherine Howard did something unique in the history of the Tower. She called for the constable, Sir John Gage. She told him she had never seen a person beheaded. She was afraid she would flinch. She was afraid she would struggle. She wanted to die with the dignity of a queen, even if the law said she was a traitor. She asked for the block to be brought to her room. The heavy piece of wood was carried in. Katherine cleared a space in the center of the room. She knelt. She gathered her skirts. She placed her neck on the curved groove. She tested the height. She adjusted her position. She rose and then she did it again. She was 19 years old. It is an image of such profound sadness that it stops the breath. A child abandoned by everyone, her father, her uncle, her husband, trying to control the only thing she had left, the manner of her own exit. The sun rose on a cold, damp Monday. The crowd had gathered early on Tower Green. This was a private execution reserved for high-ranking prisoners within the walls of the fortress. A public execution on Tower Hill would have been too riotous, too humiliating for the king. Katherine was dressed in black velvet. She was so weak from months of terror and confinement that she could barely walk. 2 guards had to support her as she walked the short distance from the royal apartments to the scaffold. She climbed the wooden stairs. The executioner, a man whose face was hidden, knelt and asked for her forgiveness. This was the custom. He was merely the tool of the law. She granted it. Then she turned to the crowd. History has given us a romantic legend. You will often hear that she stood tall and shouted, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of a Culpeper." It is a great line. It sounds like a Hollywood movie, but it is a myth invented centuries later by Victorian novelists. The reality recorded by eyewitnesses like the merchant Otwell Johnson was far more tragic in its compliance. Katherine did exactly what she had been trained to do her whole life. She obeyed. She spoke with a trembling voice. She confessed that she had sinned against God. She admitted that her punishment was just and right, according to the laws of the realm. And then she prayed for the king. Even in her final moments, she was trying to protect her family. She knew that if she showed anger, if she cursed the king, Henry's wrath would fall on her brothers and sisters. So she blessed the man who was killing her. She knelt. She refused the blindfold. She knew what to do. She had practiced. She placed her head on the block. She stretched out her arms, the signal to the executioner. The axe fell. One blow. Her head was held up to the crowd. So perish all the king's enemies. Minutes later, a dazed and babbling Lady Rochford was led up the same steps. She saw the blood of her mistress on the straw. She, too, was dispatched quickly. The bodies were handled roughly. They were wrapped in plain sheets. There was no coffin ready. They were carried a few yards away to the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, St. Peter in chains. The flagstones of the chancel floor were lifted. The earth was dug up. Katherine's body was thrown into the pit. She was laid to rest just a few feet away from her cousins Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn. In that small, cold chapel lie 3 victims of the Howard ambition. 3 young people who were pushed into the king's path by the Duke of Norfolk and who were destroyed by the machinery of the Tudor state. There was no monument. No stone marked the spot. For 300 years she lay in anonymity until Queen Victoria ordered the chapel renovated in the 19th century. King Henry VIII did not attend the funeral. He was already moving on. He was revitalized. The ulcer on his leg still pained him, and he was growing fatter and sicker, but his appetite for marriage was not sated. Within a year and a half, he would marry his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr. The Duke of Norfolk, the uncle who had engineered Catherine's rise and then called for her burning, survived. He was a Teflon politician. He would stay in power almost to the end of Henry's reign, though he too would eventually end up in the Tower, saved from the axe only by the king's own death. But what of Katherine? For centuries, she was a punchline. She was the stupid wife, the slut. But if you look at the arc of her life, from the poverty of her childhood to the neglect of the dormitory, from the grooming by Mannix to the abuse by Derham, and finally to the terrifying cage of the royal marriage, a different picture emerges. She was not a player in this ruthless game of power. She was merely a pawn. She was moved across the board by ambitious men, used for a momentary advantage, and then sacrificed when the strategy demanded it. She sought love in the only way she had been taught, through physical affection. She sought safety in the only way she knew, by pleasing men. In the end, Katherine Howard was guilty of only one thing: being a normal, flawed, romantic teenager in a world that demanded she be a statue of virtue. She was the rose without a thorn, crushed by a hand that didn't know how to hold her. The axe blow that ended Catherine's life did more than just silence a young girl. It sent shockwaves through the history of England that are still felt today. The physical body was gone, dissolved into the dust of the chapel floor. But the specter of Katherine Howard refused to vanish. Her death marked the beginning of the end for the old nobility's stranglehold on the crown and accelerated the king's descent into the monstrous caricature of his final years. As the blood was scrubbed from the scaffold, the survivors began to write the history books, burying the truth of the abused child beneath the legend of the wanton queen. But even centuries of judgment could not fully extinguish the tragic reality of the rose without a thorn. If Katherine Howard was the victim of this tragedy, her uncle, Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, was the villain. He was the architect of her rise and the first to call for her blood when she fell. The Duke's behavior in the winter of 1541 is a masterclass in political survival. When the scandal broke, he didn't try to defend his niece. He didn't plead for exile instead of execution. He went on the offensive. He wrote a letter to the king that is breathtaking in its coldness. He claimed that when he heard the news of Catherine's abominable deeds, he felt such grief that he tore his own flesh. He referred to her not as his family, but as a pestilence. He suggested that she should be burned alive, a punishment usually reserved for heresy or husband murder, petty treason, which was far more painful than beheading. Why such brutality? Because the Duke knew the king. He knew that Henry VIII felt humiliated, and the only way to survive the king's humiliation was to be angrier than the king was. By demanding the most horrific death for his niece, the Duke proved his loyalty to the crown was stronger than his loyalty to his blood. It worked, but only for a time. The fall of Katherine Howard broke the power of the Catholic conservative faction. They never truly recovered. The Duke remained in power, a grim and lonely figure, watching the Protestant reformers like Edward Seymour rise. 5 years later, in 1546, the axe finally came for him. Henry VIII, dying and paranoid, ordered the Duke of Norfolk's arrest. He was sentenced to die on the morning of January 29th, 1547. But on the night of January 28th, the king died. In the chaos of the succession, the Duke's execution was delayed and then canceled. He remained a prisoner in the Tower, the same tower where his nieces Anne and Catherine had died, throughout the reign of Edward VI, only to be released by Mary the Fir. He died in his bed at age 80, a dinosaur of a bygone age, having outlived the wives he sacrificed. For Henry VIII, the betrayal of Katherine Howard was the final psychological blow. Before Catherine, Henry could blame his marital failures on others. Catherine of Aragon, God's will, Leviticus. Anne Boleyn, a witch and a traitor. Anne of Cleves, a bad portrait. But Katherine Howard, he had chosen her. He had adored her. He had publicly thanked God for her. Her betrayal proved that he was no longer the golden prince who could command love. He was just a fat, sick old man whom a teenager had to be paid to touch. After 1542, the king changed. He became more reclusive. His eating spiraled out of control, accelerating his obesity and likely his type 2 diabetes. The pain in his leg became constant. He married once more, to Catherine Parr, but there was no romance there. He needed a nurse, not a lover. In his final years, Henry became a tyrant of the purest sort, capricious, cruel, and terrifying. The rose without a thorn had pricked him, and the wound never healed. Catherine's death left a bizarre legal legacy. The Bill of Attainder that killed her introduced a specific terrifying clause into English law. The royal assent to the bill formally decreed that it constituted high treason for any woman to wed the sovereign if she was not a pure maiden, unless she had explicitly disclosed her unchaste status beforehand. Furthermore, this liability extended to her inner circle, making it an act of high treason for any third parties, including servants or family members, to conceal knowledge of the queen's unchastity from the king. This law turned the private romantic past of any future queen into a state security concern, alarming England's noble families. When Henry sought a sixth wife, court jests claimed no noblewoman would accept him, fearing that even a minor youthful indiscretion could lead to severe consequences. This is likely why Henry's next choice was Catherine Parr, a wealthy widow twice over. She was not a virgin, and everyone knew it. Her unchastity was a matter of public record, so she was safe from the law that killed Katherine Howard. For 400 years, history was written by men who shared Henry VIII's view of women. To Victorian historians, Katherine Howard was a moral cautionary tale. Agnes Strickland, writing in the 19th century, described her as a juvenile delinquent. Other historians called her a common prostitute or intellectually vacuous. The narrative was simple. She was a stupid, lustful girl who threw away a crown for a fling. Over the past 30 to 40 years, historians have applied feminist perspectives to examine power imbalances in Katherine Howard's life, with scholars like Lacey Baldwin Smith and Alison Weir noting significant age disparities in her early relationships with older men, such as Henry Mannix in his 30s and Francis Derham in his 20s, during her time in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household. Modern views often depict her as influenced by coercive dynamics in a patriarchal court, leading her to use personal connections for survival amid political volatility. Her involvement with Thomas Culpeper is thus seen as a strategic move for protection during Henry VIII's declining health, rather than mere impulsiveness. We explicitly return to the haunted gallery not just for the ghost story, but for what it represents. That lingering scream, heard by centuries of visitors, is not just a spectral echo. It is the enduring sound of a realization, the terrifying moment a young girl understood that her fairy tale had become a nightmare and that the doors of mercy were forever locked. In 1999, psychologists from the University of Hertfordshire conducted a controlled experiment in the gallery. They found that people consistently reported unease and strange feelings in specific spots. While the scientists attributed this to drafty architecture and subsonic sound waves, the cultural memory persists. Why does this ghost story endure? Because it captures the emotional truth of Catherine's life. She is eternally frozen in that moment of realization, the moment she realized that the fairy tale was a horror story and that nobody was coming to save her. Katherine Howard is buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. In the Victorian era, when the floor was dug up to fix the foundations, they found the skeletons of the executed. Anne Boleyn's bones were identified. The Duke of Northumberland's were found, but Catherine's were harder to find. Because she was so young and because her body had been thrown into the earth with quicklime, which speeds up decomposition, there was very little left of her. She had almost completely dissolved into the dust of the tower. There is a profound sadness in that. The system that used her, abused her, and killed her also erased her. But we remember her. We remember her not as the bad wife, but as the rose without a thorn who was never allowed to bloom. We remember the girl who practiced with the block because she wanted to be perfect, even in death. Her story is a mirror held up to the Tudor world, reflecting not the glory of the king, but the brutality of a society where a young girl's life was worth less than a king's pride.